Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 719 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are excited to rebroadcast our interview with Dr. Abby Smith, originally released on June 12th of 2015. Listeners, Abby's research focuses on shells and the organisms that make shells. She uses information captured in shells to better understand environmental geochemistry, as well as the impacts of seawater temperature and the effects of ocean acidification. And in our conversation, Abby shared some great insights about her life in science. So get ready to sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Abby Smith. So, Abby, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So I'm going to start off telling them just a little bit about you, Abby. Now, listeners, Abby is an associate professor and head of the Department of Marine Science at the University of Otago. She received her bachelor's degree in Geology and Biology from Colby College and a master's degree in Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences from MIT. She then received her PhD in Earth Science from the University of Waikato, and afterward, she joined the faculty there where she is today at the University of Otago. And now, listeners, Abby is here with us today to tell us about her journey through life in science. So, Abby, today we are looking forward to getting to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us about your non-scientific side and what you like to do when you're not hard at work in the lab?
I'm busy, very busy mother of two. I've had children the whole time that I've been a scientist almost, and I have always been balancing the demands of the family with the demands of the job. So my children are now 16 and 19, so they're not that much trouble anymore. I just have to drive them places. We're all very mad keen cricket fans, and I followed the latest World Cup cricket with great enthusiasm that happened earlier this year. I'm a knitter, and I'm very keen in the kitchen. I enjoy cooking very much, and recently I've been working on jams and preserves and finding out different ways to make fruit to last all winter.
Wonderful. Well, do you have a signature jam or preserve worked out yet?
Well, no, I'm trying lots of different things at the moment, and I'm covered with burns as a consequence, but I'm working on it.
Gotcha.
Getting my technique right. But I enjoy it very much, and it's a good way to spend the weekend not working, which I would prefer to do.
Gotcha. Those kitchen experiments, I think they get you every time. We have a pear tree at our home, so it's always trying to find new things to do with pears every year. Well, wonderful to hear a little bit about your life outside of science. And I think it's hard to find time to do everything that you want to sometime. And you mentioned you were, throughout your career, balancing a family with the career, with everything else you like to do. Do you have a secret? What things really got you through?
Well, partly I was part-time when the children were small. So I did quit every day at 3 when they were in school. That was really good. Finding excellent daycare that you really trust and like is important when they're small. At the university here, our daycare begins essentially at 6 weeks old. Both my children started at 6 weeks old, but because it's just down the street, there was never any problem to go down at lunchtime or anytime they wanted me, and that was always very handy to be able to look after them, but also get my work done. One of my tricks is certainly not to work when I'm not at work. I don't take work home. I don't work on the weekends. I don't usually work at night. And even when I became head of department and my workload tripled all of a sudden, I've tried really hard to maintain that.
Well, I am impressed, Abby. That is something I struggle with. I'm one of these addicted to email people. No matter where I am, I'm checking my work email, and I need to stop it. I'm trying to work on that.
I check mine every morning in bed and get ready for the day, even before I get out of bed. But I don't do it at night. Sometime after 8 o'clock, the phone goes off.
Well, thank you for sharing your tips and tricks from an expert there. I love it. And great to hear, like I said, about your life outside of science. But we are going to switch over to the science next. So, Abby, can you tell us how you describe what you do at work to someone who's not familiar with science?
Sure, I study shells. I'm a biogeochemist, which means that I'm interested in the animals that make the shells, how fast they grow, how fast they make shells, what they make the shells out of. I'm interested in the chemistry of the shells, what they're made of, and how the qualities of the water affect the composition of the shell. And I'm interested in the geology of shells, where they end up, how they break down, what happens to them after the animal has long gone. And can you look at really old shells and find out what the water was like in the deep past? So those are the things I do. I look at shells for various reasons.
Very, very interesting. So what is the oldest shell you've ever studied?
Most of the ones I study are here and now today, but I have looked back into the Ordovician. That's 500 million years.
Oh, wow. Very cool. Did the shells look any different back then?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And some of the things that you think of when you say the word shell were not even on the planet then. Mm-hmm. But some things that look similar were. The ones I study, they're called bryozoans, and they are like corals in that they're colonial. They grow little trees or maybe crusts or maybe some other shape made out of lots and lots of little animals that are all cooperating together. So those ones were in the sea in the Ordovician, and they're in the sea today.
Well, I'm looking forward to chatting more about these bryozoans as we go through our interview. I think most of us, when we think of shells, you think of sort of the spirally, almost clamshell shape. So wonderful to hear a little bit more about the variety of different things that are out there. And we're going to take a pit stop here and talk a little bit about motivation. I think we touched on some of the struggles that scientists face just in terms of getting everything packed into an already packed day. And I love getting tidbits of motivation from everyone that I talk to. So Abby, can you share with us what you think is your favorite motivational or inspirational quote?
Yes, I have to turn around and look at it. If we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research.
I like it. That's one of my favorites too.
Yes.
So tell us why that's your favorite.
Because it encapsulates what science really is instead of what people teach you that science is. So when you're in school, you learn that science is facts, and you memorize a whole bunch of facts, and if you're good at that, you get A's. But it turns out when you go to become a scientist that facts are irrelevant and that memorization is not helpful, and what you need to do is solve problems, figure out how to do it, fix the broken thing, take another sample, figure out what that sample is telling you, decide how you're going to answer the next question, and you've got no guidance, and you've got no recipe, and you've got nothing to help you. And so it's that wonderful sense of being adrift in ignorance, but looking for the truth that makes science worth doing. And that quote really encapsulates it for people who are still young scientists who haven't yet figured out that it's not all about facts and memorizing.
Well, I love it. And I think that major shift in thinking often happens for a lot of young scientists sort of between undergraduate and graduate school. I know that's when it happened for me, when I started realizing that, wait, we don't know all the answers. And when I'm asking my professors questions and they can't answer them either, I think that's a really exciting moment in science.
It's the best.
Yeah. So wonderful to hear about one of these quotes that's kind of in your mind, one of these things that sounds like you have posted on your wall in your office somewhere.
I do.
Wonderful. But next, I want to chat about some of the people who've motivated or inspired you. Abby, can you tell us about some of these role models you've had in your career?
I'd like to tell you about Professor Marcus Key. He works in the United States in Pennsylvania, and I met him at a conference. He's actually the same age as I am, so he's not really a mentor, but I met him at a conference, and I thought, this has got to be the most obnoxious man I have ever met in my life. He has a particularly lively sense of humor, and he's quite in your face in many ways. And I've lived in New Zealand for 25 years, and New Zealanders are quite reserved, and I'd kind of forgotten what Americans were like anyway. So I just thought, I could never like this guy. But he is one of the finest scientists I've ever met, and he has an outstanding sense of right and wrong, which is something you really need in science because you have to always tell the truth. And you could sit there and say, you could squeeze this little bit of extra data. You could pretend that something happened, and you mustn't ever do those things, even though it's tempting. And he has got a wonderful sense of what is acceptable and what isn't. And in the end, he and I worked together extensively. I visited his university. I've stayed at his house. I know his kids. He's visited my university, stayed at my house. He knows my kids. We've written a number of papers together, and we think very similarly, although I hope I'm not as obnoxious as he is. But what I really learned from Marcus was, first of all, don't decide you can't work with someone just because you don't like them the first day you meet them. And second of all, that you just have to always toe the line and be 100% accurate and throw it out if it's not good data. You got to be really, really completely committed to telling the truth.
Absolutely. And I think the whole point of science is this sort of quest for truth, the knowledge that's out there. And I love this description that you're giving of a sense of right and wrong. I think there's way more gray area in science than a lot of people realize when you're trying to decide whether this is good data or bad data. Is it something you can use or should use, and how you interpret it, even if you do decide the right way of whether to use it or not. I think there's a lot more gray area, a lot more unknown than a lot of people realize. So very interesting.
That's very true. And when you put something into a machine and the machine gives you a number, it's not enough to say, okay, thanks, machine.
Right.
You have to say, okay, now what can this machine do and what can't do? And what does this number mean? And do I believe it? And did I do everything I needed to make sure this machine would tell me everything I needed to know? And it's quite harder than people realize to get data out of a machine because you have to really know the machine.
And oftentimes people wrote the algorithms that are plugged into the machine. So there's that human factor.
Exactly. And then you put it all in your spreadsheet and you forgot to do some formula or other and it turns out all wrong. And you think, what?
Right.
That happens all the time. You have to be really critical and you have to really care.
Absolutely. Well, a wonderful role model, it sounds like, and an unexpected friendship that came out of maybe a first impression that didn't go quite right. Well, Abby, wonderful to hear about one of these people who's had an impact on your career. And I want to take us back to the beginning now. Can you take us all the way back to your early days and tell us what sparked your interest in science to begin with?
I suppose it was probably the beach.
Really? I like the beach as well.
Yeah. I grew up in Boston, and my parents have a beach house along with a bunch of other family on the coast of Maine. So when Boston becomes untenable in July and August, we used to go live in Maine. And it was every single day the exact same thing, and no TV, no phone, no electricity, not much happening up there. And we ended up just down at the beach playing every single day. And when I went on and learned things about the animals and plants that were there, I used to lead little trips around on the rocks, telling people stories about the animals and plants that you could find there. And when someone was visiting, they'd bring them over to my house and say, "Can Abby take our friend out to show her what's in the tide pools?"
The wildlife tour, yeah.
That's what I really loved doing. And in between high school and university, I worked at the New England Aquarium. I worked behind the scenes actually feeding fish and things, but I also worked up front telling visitors stories about the things they were seeing. I discovered when I had children, I'm a natural storyteller. I like telling stories. And this was the beginning of that, really. So I wanted to work by the sea all my life. And I can vividly recall telling some boyfriend or other that I wanted to be an oceanographer. And he said, "You can't be an oceanographer. You're really small and you're a girl."
Oh, no.
And I thought, well, there you go.
Well, that's the end.
So this year I'm teaching practical and field oceanography to my students.
Oh, wonderful. So you started off fairly early with this interface with the public, teaching them about the things that you're passionate about in science. Is this something that you've continued today?
Yes, absolutely. Education is my family's industry. All my parents and grandparents are teachers or professors. All my siblings are teachers or professors. What we do is educate. And I'm happy to be in that family industry. I love it very much. Once I was offered a job that was entirely research and had no teaching, and I just couldn't see my way clear to taking a job like that. I do enjoy my research, but I absolutely adore my teaching. So I teach at first year level, brand new young students who just come out of high school. I teach postgraduate level. I teach in between. I teach as much as I can possibly squeeze in. Plus, I work with the public.
Oh, wow. How do you fit it all in, Abby? I must ask.
I'm just organized.
Gotcha. Well, wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with the public? Do you do lectures or things out in the public, or are there certain activities that you coordinate?
What I used to do was go and give talks or work with the public and so on. But as I've run out of time, what I do now is train people who do that. So I give the scientific information to the volunteers and teachers who were working with school children and with the public. And then they actually provide the material to the public, but I'm heavily involved in the development of it.
Wonderful. Well, great to hear that you are moving forward with the family business, helping to educate people about science and get people excited about it really at all levels. I think that's phenomenal. And we were chatting about your journey through science. I think we made it up to your undergraduate studies where you started getting excited about science, started taking some of those science courses. Can you tell us now, Abby, what are some of the key moments from that point that really took you to where you are today, all the way over in New Zealand now?
Well, they were interesting, really. The first one was a field course. Colby College occasionally runs semesters abroad for its students, and I was lucky to be accepted to a semester 2 field course in Bermuda. And we worked at the Bermuda Biological Station on marine carbonates, which are the sediments made from shells. And I really solidified what I wanted to do scientifically during that course, that was what I really loved, because although I enjoy marine biology, I really hadn't trained to be a biologist particularly. I really loved geology, and this was a way I could do both. It wasn't until my PhD that I discovered chemistry had its place in that group as well. And I resisted enthusiastically, but in the end I had to capitulate and say, yep, we better learn some chemistry and put that in the mix as well. And actually I enjoy that enormously now. The other thing that happened was that in my last year at Colby, I fell on the ice and damaged my hip very badly. And I was in a wheelchair for 3 months, and then I was on 2 crutches for another 3 months, and then on 1 crutch, and it slowed me down considerably. And the result was that I canceled all my attempts to go to really interesting and exotic graduate schools.
Oh, no.
I was planning to apply to study oceanography anywhere from Florida to Alaska, and once I became non-mobile, and I suppose if you had been in a wheelchair all your life, you might be brave enough to do this, but I had only just started, and I wasn't brave enough to go very far. So I ended up applying to a university that my dad worked at. which it turns out is MIT, which is not shabby or anything.
Not a bad place to go, yeah.
And I got to do the Woods Hole Joint program, which is astonishingly great. It's as good as oceanography gets, and I'm not complaining at all. But it wasn't my intention to do that. And so while I was at MIT, I met my future husband, who was at Harvard. He is a New Zealander, and the conditions of his visa were that he had to return home after he finished his study. So we got married, we moved back to New Zealand, and I loved it. Then we found a university that would give us 2 jobs.
That's what I was just going to ask about.
Once you find that, you don't go anywhere.
Now, was it a challenge to find positions at the same place? I mean, New Zealand is a relatively small place. How was the job search like there?
It's advantages and disadvantages. It's a relatively small place, so everybody knows everybody and everybody knows what's going down with everybody. So it's not like he could apply for a job and pretend he didn't have a wife and then later arrive with me. You can't pretend you're not together in any way, although we have different last names and sometimes the students don't pick it up, which always makes me laugh.
Right.
But the way it worked was that he got a job and I came along, and I just kept hassling the people in the marine science department until they gave me something. Essentially.
I like your persistence.
Yeah. In the first 10 years I was here, I was in part-time and casual contracts. And then finally someone came in charge who said, we need to rationalize that, and gave me a real job. So it was difficult and stressful, but we were certainly able to live off his income and whatever bits I could get. I would have loved to have a proper lectureship where I could work full-time and produce better than I did. But I learned a lot from being part-time. I learned a lot about doing the job you're paid to do and not doing other stuff. And I learned a lot about how to say no to people. And I learned a lot about making the time for my family and making sure that I didn't work when I wasn't being paid to work. And those things have all served me well.
Well, Abby, I am so glad that you shared your story with us today. I think this has so many important points for our listeners out there who might be in the same position, kind of struggling through whether it's a 2-body problem or just finding one job in a certain place, how to cope with that. And I think in science right now, with the job market as it is, sometimes you do have to take these temporary positions and kind of piece things together until you can solidify something a little bit more permanent. So wonderful to hear how you worked through it and got a fantastic position where you are today. And I want to know more about this position and what you're up to now. So can you share with us one of these projects that you're working on that you are the most excited about?
Well, I wish I could show you. I have this bryozoan. It's on my desk, in fact. And bryozoans sometimes are called lace corals because they're sort of like a little hard net. Go on Google, all you listeners, and look up bryozoans and find a picture of a lace coral because they're as pretty as can be. And I have one on my desk that is purple.
Ooh.
They're almost always white. And this one is purple. And the thing is, it's been bleached, and it's still purple. It's been boiled in ethanol, and it's still purple. It's been put into solvent after solvent to try to remove the purple dye, whatever it is, and it's still purple. And this leads me to believe that it's got something structurally in the mineral that it made its skeleton out of that makes it purple, rather than an organic purple dye, which you might find in a seaweed or you might find in a purple snail. If you put those guys in bleach, if you boil those guys, the dye comes out into the water. But this bryozoan has got me stumped, and I can't get it to release its organic dye. So I'm at the stage now of trying to figure out what minerals or elements that are incorporated into the skeleton have made it so purple that I can't make the purple get out of the skeleton.
I am fascinated by this mystery.
Me too.
Is there any advantage that you know of the purple color?
None at all. This genus, which is called Eodictium, about half the species are white, half the species are purple. People have, since the 1850s, have been mentioning that you can't get the purple out of the skeleton of these particular species. We don't know why. We don't know what. I can't think of any reason. This is all under organic material normally. Just is.
Well, this is just one of the wonderful mysteries of life, Abby. I'm stumped by this as well.
If you grind it up, you get purple powder. It's just surprising. That's all. In all my life, I'm always drawn to the things that don't make sense.
And I think that's part of the allure of science, certainly. So is this an isolated mystery, or do you come across a lot of these mysterious occurrences in your field that you're trying to piece together to make a bigger picture out of?
Not quite as mysterious as this one. Usually I'll do a group of something. I'll look at a bunch of barnacles, and one of them will be different than the others, and I'll sort of ask myself why and start investigating, and then I might find out that it eats a different thing or lives in different water or something. Quite often there's an explanation that's relatively straightforward to find, or sometimes it turns out that it doesn't belong in the group, and I can find that out by looking at the skeleton. But this bryozoan is certainly an unusual mystery, and I suppose that's why it's my favorite at the moment.
Well, let's talk big picture of the bryozoans here for a moment. Can you give our audience a little bit of perspective on why these are important and what they do out in the ocean?
I just want to say that it doesn't matter to me whether they're important or not. Mm-hmm. I have tenure. I'm going to be here forever. I can study anything I want. I study them because I love them and because I am mystified by them and because they are stunning and because no one else does, but not because I'm going to feed anybody or change the world in any significant way. Having said that, the kind of thing I do with regard to what things are made of and how they react with seawater is turning out to be quite relevant in the debate around ocean acidification. So as the ocean gets more acid, it's harder and harder to make a shell. And the question is, how is it affecting things that are making shells right now? How did it affect them in the deep past when we had high CO2 levels in the atmosphere in the past? And how can we predict what might happen in 100 years when the ocean will have dropped another couple of pH units? At what point will we have nothing that can ever make a shell? And what would that be like if there were no shells, no skeletons? And I think that kind of discussion, depressing though it is a place where knowing a lot about how shells are made, what they're made of, and what happens to them after death turns out to be quite relevant. Even though I took this on knowing that it had no application in the real world at all, it turns out that ocean acidification has provided an application for the kind of science I do.
Certainly. And I think this is an important point about basic research in general is oftentimes when people are fascinated by a thing, an area, a topic, there's no immediate known application of it. But further down the line, things spring up, pieces get connected that weren't connected before, where your piece now suddenly fits into a bigger picture that becomes very, very important for other fields and other topics. So interesting to hear about your work, a little bit more detail. And I'm going to have to check back with you in a few years on these purple bryozoans and see if you have a solution, Abby. I'm counting on you for this one.
It's a little bit dismaying to make up your mind that you're going to be the kind of scientist who sits in a room and writes papers and is never interviewed on the radio. And then something happens and you're thrust into the wider world. It is a little unnerving. I had all planned to be an obscure scientist for my whole life. And now I'm the chair of the blah, blah committee thing, and I'm the president of the other what's it, and I hosted the ocean acidification workshop earlier this year and so forth. And it's like, oh, okay, now I have to step up a little and be more important than I wanted to be.
You weren't ready for the spotlight, but you're doing great, Abby. Well, wonderful to hear more about your work. And I think so far we've made it sound like a really exciting adventure, and you're working on some phenomenal and fascinating questions. But I want to hear about the challenges, Abby, the hard times. I think every scientist has them, and it's important to talk about them so other people out there can get a realistic idea of what scientists are facing on a daily basis, some of these big challenges, as well as the sort of day-to-day things that come up. So can you tell us about some of yours?
Well, one of them is certainly workload. Everybody thinks that because you got computers, we can do everything faster, and that means we have less to do. But it seems to me that we have more to do.
The expectations just keep going up, yeah.
Up and up and up. And things that used to be done by other people are now done by scientists. So when I started teaching 25 years ago, many of my senior colleagues dictated their notes to a secretary who typed them up and put them on overheads for them to then go and present for their lectures. Well, now I make all my own PowerPoints, of course. And if I need to photocopy something, I do it myself. And if I need to scan something, I do it myself. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but it means that a lot of tasks that someone else used to do for us, we're now expected to do for ourselves, and especially around editing of papers and that kind of thing. So that's interesting. Workload is a challenge, and it always probably will because most scientists are pretty ambitious and often quite driven. Another challenge is obviously the small children thing. And when I first had children, I had female graduate students coming into my office all the time saying, "How's it going? Is this possible? We're watching you."
Right.
And no pressure.
Spotlight again.
I used to say to them, it's perfectly possible as long as it's not raining and nobody's sick.
This is true.
Because it's very close to the edge of possible. And so when something goes wrong, it becomes impossible. I've just discovered that you just have to say, oh, well, world's not going to end. Oh, well.
Right.
And not really need to be perfect. And not really need for everything to go great every second. And learn how to apologize. Learn how to postpone meetings. Learn how to say, I really screwed up then. I forgot all about it. I'm really sorry. And because those are the skills you need.
Absolutely. Well, I love this sort of sense of humility that you're painting as a necessary skill for scientists. I mean, being willing to do everything. I know on a day I might be cleaning the floor, making copies, and working on a grant. So you're doing a little bit of everything right now. And I think also this sense of humility of not having everything perfect. And that's something I think a lot of scientists struggle with, because a lot of us are inherently sort of type A perfectionist kind of people, but you do just have to let things go. And sometimes good enough is good enough. So,
well, sometimes even bad is the best you can do.
Right.
The other thing I'd like to say is that I have a visual disability, so I don't see very well. And one of my eyes doesn't work at all well. And I have a special big screen, and when I get tired at the end of the day, I let my computer talk to me so I don't have to read it. And I have people at work who know that they better give me things in fairly large print. And I work, and I find sometimes by the end of the day, I'm pretty frustrated by not having been able to do what I might have done when I was younger or when things worked better. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that scientists are human beings, that they have disabilities, visible or not visible, that they have gender, that they have sexuality, that they have family situations, that they have pets that need to be put down. They have stuff happening in their lives all the time, and that it's not reasonable to think, oh, white coat, no feelings, no life.
Right.
It's not true. It's not reasonable, and no one should expect that of themselves.
Well, I think you brought up so many important points, Abby. I love it. And I think just this idea that life happens and scientists are people too are just really important points that we try and drive home on our program. So great to hear about some of the challenges that you face. But next, I want to talk success. So Abby, can you tell us about one of these successes that you've had? And it can be a big success or even just a little victory along the way.
It was really wonderful when my colleagues in the department, I worked in this department for 22 years, and my colleagues in the department unanimously decided they wanted me to lead them for a period of time. And that was wonderful.
Certainly. So how did the news come to you? Was this a committee decision and you were sort of eagerly waiting outside the door, or was this a surprise?
No. The way this works is the head of department is appointed by the dean or the equivalent of the dean, and the dean seeks advice from the department. So people would have told the dean what they thought privately, and the dean would make a decision. But the dean was kind enough to advise me that he had only heard good things. So that was really nice.
Well, wonderful. Congratulations on this prestigious post. So how did you celebrate once you got the news, Abby?
You should the same way I always do, pizza and beer. You take the girl out of America, but you can't take America out of the girl.
Well, pizza and beer is a pretty irresistible combination. What kind of pizza do you prefer? Do you have a favorite topping?
Actually, I just like plain.
Really?
Garlic, a lot of garlic. I like anchovies, too.
Interesting. I'm more of a mushrooms and olives kind of person, but I can appreciate the plain.
Well, yeah, that's vegetables.
Well, wonderful to hear about one of these successes. And I think so important to get that recognition, validation from your colleagues and have yourself know that they're respecting your work and what you're contributing to the group. So
that's true. And also the dean said one of the reasons he wanted to appoint me was because I was a good example of work-life balance. And part of me thought, well, if only you knew, Buster. But
right. On the outside,
I do try really hard not to work when I'm not working. So, yeah, it was nice to see that recognized.
Well, I think that's so important to have that recognized at the dean level as something that's a priority for the faculty. I think that really speaks a lot.
Best university in the whole world.
Yeah. Well, wonderful to hear more about the culture of your university and the success that you shared with us. And I think we talked about all of the variety of different things that you try and pack into your day as a scientist. And I think one of the things for me, at least, that usually falls by the wayside, I can squeeze in a few minutes before I fall asleep at night, is reading. But I love getting book recommendations from everyone and anyone that I talk to. So Abby, can you add one to my list today and tell me about a book that you've read and really enjoyed?
So it's not going to be a science book. I just want to tell you right away.
That's fair.
I have two. The best book ever written was Dorothy L. Sayers' Murder Must Advertise.
Interesting. I've not read it.
This one is beautiful. And the other one is a book I've read recently. It's called The Little Women Letters, I think. It's not that new, but it's not old like Dorothy L. Sayers. It's probably in the last decade or so. If you were the sort of child who read Little Women, it is the book for you.
Wonderful. Well, fantastic recommendations, Abby. We will put those out on our website for our avid reading listeners out there if they're looking for their next book. And one of the things we've sort of touched on as we talked about all your different opportunities and experiences throughout your career are some of the places that you've been for science. And I think this is a perk of the career for sure. Going to different places, sharing your research for training opportunities, things like that. Can you think back now, Abby, on all the places that you've been and tell us about your favorite place that you've been for science?
Sicily.
Really?
Awesome. Fabulous food. Amazing sunshine. People talk about the Mediterranean light, and it was really right there. And plus, Italian. Guys. And it was a fantastic conference, and I was with some of my best friends, and my sisters came over a week beforehand, and we had just plain my sisters and me in the streets of Sicily eating strawberries.
Well, that sounds phenomenal. Did you get to enjoy some fantastic pizza while you were there, plain with garlic?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Not so much beer.
Gotcha. So what was one of your favorite things that you saw or did while you were in Sicily?
Eating fresh strawberries, fresh tomatoes, buffalo mozzarella on fresh basil and tomato. Unbelievable.
Did you do any gelato while you were there?
Absolutely. They have a special thing called granita, which is like a snow cone, only like 10 million times better. And watermelon granita when it's really hot out, let me tell you.
Perfect.
And I should have told you about the science, and all I did was talk about the food.
No. So tell us a little bit about the scientific occasion that brought you to Sicily.
Oh, I'm a member of the International Bryozoology Association, and the 70 of us or so meet every 3 years, and it's a highlight. It's where I met Marcus and some other great friends, and every 3 years we get together and have an amazing scientific experience as well as a fabulous get-together.
Definitely. So is it always in Sicily, or does it move around?
Moves around. It'll be in Australia next year.
Wonderful. Well, again, wonderful to hear about these travel opportunities. And I think to share with the listeners some of these opportunities that you get as a scientist, if you're not familiar with what the life of a scientist really looks like. I think travel is a really big part of it. And one of the things that's also a big part of it that we haven't chatted too much about is the culture, the traditions, the people that you get to work with. And we've talked a little bit about some of the stereotypes about scientists. I think oftentimes scientists do kind of foresee themselves being this sort of quiet in their corner, doing their own thing for the rest of their career. But I think oftentimes that's not the case. And you mentioned yourself that you were kind of brought into the spotlight with this work on ocean acidification. And I think out of these labs, out of these collaborations, out of these groups that you work with, you get some fun traditions and just funny memories that you share with people. So can you share with us, Abby, a story of the human side of science and tell us about one of your experiences?
So I went on sabbatical at Dickinson College with my mate Marcus, and we discovered that we have really, really different work styles. So in New Zealand, people go to work at 8:30, and at 10:30 they stop and have a cup of tea. We have a special room where everybody stops and has a cup of tea or coffee.
That sounds wonderful.
Anybody, you can't talk to anybody at 10:30 till 11:15. Some people have the timing a little different, but essentially you have a 2-hour work period, and then you have a cup of tea, and then you have another 2-hour work period, and then you have lunch, and then you have 2 or 3 hours, and then you have a cup of tea. That's about 3:30, and then you go till the end of the day. So there's these very clear programmed breaks, and they're in our contracts. I mean, they're real, and we have to provide a tea room and all the facilities for all our staff. And nobody does the thing you do in America where you have a cup of coffee on your desk all the time and you keep going back and refilling it whenever it suits you. What people do is they don't have anything like that, and then they go to the tea room and have a period of time together. And in our tea room, there's a daily quiz in the newspaper, and in our tea room, we do the quiz together as a group, which is usually quite funny. Anyway, when I went to meet Marcus and live in Dickinson College and stuff, I discovered there was no morning tea break. In fact, there wasn't even tea. Right. And I'm like, okay, supermarket, jug, cup of tea, cup.
Making my own tea.
I had to get it all set. And he was just completely disgusted. I would make him stop at 10:30 for a cup of tea, and he would complain the whole time. But actually, he got quite used to it. And when he came here on sabbatical, he could see how it worked, and he enjoyed it very much.
Oh, that is hilarious.
We quite often discover things about the world when we do this traveling through it thing.
Absolutely. And I think you do take for granted some of the traditions, some of the things that are just normal wherever you are. And it's sort of in stark contrast. The lab that I work in, you sort of shovel down lunch while working on your computer on whatever you're working on. And then you can chat intermittently throughout the day with the rest of the people in the lab, but there's no set break time really. So very interesting.
Well, some of the people in this office I have worked next to for 23 years, and we know each other extremely well. And I have their back and they have mine. And that is the nature of oceanography. You can't do marine science by yourself, ever. Nobody dives by themselves. Nobody goes on a boat by themselves. And you end up with a natural inclination to work as a team, which is why this is the best department at the best university in New Zealand.
You're really selling it. I love it.
Because people here just naturally work as colleagues, as team members, that you just don't get sort of prima donnas or people who are in their little room eating their little lunch and not really talking to anybody, because this isn't how you can make marine science work.
Gotcha. Well, wonderful to hear about these scheduled tea breaks. I must ask, do you have a favorite tea or a traditional tea that you always have in these breaks?
I usually drink Earl Grey.
Solid choice. I'm a green tea and Earl Grey. I do a little bit of both. So
green tea mint in the afternoons, I find.
Oh, very nice. Well, fantastic to hear about one of these traditions. And again, just thinking about the different cultures and different labs and different places. And we've chatted a little bit about the work that you're doing and that you've done over the course of your career. But Abby, next, I want to ask you a tough question. I want to know, if I gave you everything, if things like funding and staff and technology, feasibility were not a problem, what is the one question, the dream research question that you would want to answer?
Well, I think I'm in the process of studying all the shells I could get my little hands on in order to write some sort of a summary book before I retire. And I think that I would be able to actually look at what every single shell type is made of, and then be able to do the stats on the patterns and what it really tells us. Because I do it for small groups. I pick a group of mollusks and I study every single one I can get my hands on or something. And I can see some of the patterns emerging. But because you can't do every sample, you can't do every species, they're only emergent patterns. They aren't laid out for you. And I think probably I would do what I do, but I would do it at a much higher scale or a much greater scale.
Definitely. Well, I like this idea of a large-scale study of all the different shell types out there. I was kind of wondering if you would bring us back to our purple bryozoan, but...
It's there. He's in the list.
Yep. Well, fantastic to hear about your dream research. And I love chatting with scientists who are able to do essentially what they're most passionate about. And it sounds like this is the case for you. So that is phenomenal. And we've talked about your career and all the different phases that you've gone through, different training programs, different people that you've worked with. And I love to hear about the advice that scientists receive that maybe in hindsight, they were really glad that they accepted or that they received. So can you share with us what you would consider, Abby, the best piece of advice you've ever received from someone?
It was much before I was a scientist, because while my husband was doing his PhD, I just worked as a temp. And I was working in an office with a guy I got to be quite friendly with who was 10 years older than me. And I said to him, imagine I really would listen to you and pay attention because you're 10 years older than me. Give me the one piece of advice, the thing you've learned that you think I haven't learned yet. Mm-hmm. And he said, even when people seem like they are jerks, they mostly don't mean to be.
Interesting. That is a great piece of advice.
That was useful.
Yeah.
Because even when someone's being obstructive and difficult and you think they're a complete idiot, maybe they're just really doing what they think is right.
Definitely. And I think it helps to take that moment to put things in perspective and think, okay, maybe this person is just having a bad day or they probably didn't mean it and not take it personally. Whether they did or not, I think it helps you get through it a little better.
Well, and I think it's fair to note that most academics, most scientists think that if they argue long enough, someone will come around to their point of view. But it is actually possible for an intelligent person of good character to disagree with one. And that takes a bit of time to get used to.
Definitely. I think these academic discussions or debates oftentimes can lead to some hurt feelings, but I think definitely keeping in mind that no one is doing it to attack you personally, that it is really the science that people are so passionate about and arguing about in a lot of cases, definitely helps out. So fantastic point there and great piece of advice to share with us. Is there any other last piece of advice or maybe one last piece of inspiration that you want to end our interview on today, Abby?
Well, people often say to me, gosh, you're so organized. I could never do that. I could never do as much as you do. But, you can if you just plan ahead and commit. If you say, tomorrow, these are the things I'm going to do, and then you do those. And when other people ask you to do something else that isn't on that list, you think about whether that's worthwhile or not. You say yes or no. But you really have a plan. You get an enormous amount done in 8 hours. There's no reason to work at night and on the weekends if you really organize yourself. That's my view. Might not work for everybody. Not everybody has the personality to do it the way that I do, but it's the only way to get a ton done and still have your life.
Definitely. I think organization is key. So do you have a favorite tool or a resource or a method to your organization that really helps you accomplish it?
No, I have like 100.
Yeah.
I have a big whiteboard and I have a calendar and I have another calendar and I have a special calendar with colors on and I have a project management system and I have a lot of stuff.
Gotcha. You have a system, a carefully worked out system, it sounds like.
A lot of them.
Well, Abby, wonderful to hear about how organization helps you get so much done. And I think this is something that a lot of us can learn different ways to help ourselves get more organized, to get more done in a day so we can enjoy life more. So great note to end on. Can you tell our listeners now how they can reach out and learn more about you and your work?
Well, I have a website, but I would suggest that you're better off going to the International Bryozoology Association website and have a look at some of those wonderful photos of bryozoans, because they are unknown, inedible, ancient, and becoming extinct rapidly. And it's not their fault you don't know them.
This is true. And I'm going to have to look up this purple bryozoan after this interview. I'm very excited to check it out. Well, Abby, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
Well, it was wonderful to chat with you. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.